It's Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell.
I want to introduce you to the Cato Institute's Michael Tanner. He's on the phone with us. Michael is an author of numerous books on public policy, titles like Going for Broke, Deficits, Debt, and the Entitlement Crisis, Leviathan on the Right, How Big Government Conservatism Brought Down the Republican Revolution, among others. But he has a new book out that came out on December the 7th called The Inclusive Economy, How to Bring Wealth to America's Poor. Michael D. Tanner, Senior Fellow with the Cato Institute, joins us now. Michael, how are you?
Well, great. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning.
Yes, sir. Really glad that you could spend a little time with us. So tell us a little bit about this book. People are still procrastinators like myself. They haven't bought a Christmas present. So I'm sure people might want to purchase this and give it to a family member or a relative. Tell us about the inclusive economy. What made you want to write this?
Well, I think that for a long time, both the left and right have misdiagnosed why people are poor in America. The right has tended to blame the poor themselves and say it was bad decisions. The left has tended to blame society and say it's things like racism and sexism. I think it is actually the government that has been most responsible for why people are poor. We have policies that actually push people into poverty and then trap them there. And that if we really want to get people out of poverty, what we need to do is change government policy.
So, traditionally I've heard one of the ways that, people get trapped into poverty is with certain, the welfare programs. They do things and incentivize the wrong behavior. Sometimes people talk about the destruction of the family. You hear about people that if you're single, you're going to make more money or get more money from the government than if you're together as a cohesive family unit. Do you talk about that in the book, or is it something more than that?
Well, I do talk about that, although it is much more than that. But it is true that incentives matter. And the fact is that the welfare system as it's set up today is meant to discourages work and discourages family formation. That some of the highest marginal tax rates in the world are actually on someone who leaves welfare and takes a job. You start paying taxes on the first dollar you earn with the payroll tax. You begin to lose your benefits as soon as you earn income on your own. And then you incur the expenses of going to work, transportation, child care, clothing, and so on. The end result is that you can actually end up worse off financially if you take an entry-level job than if you remain on the dole. So we certainly have to look at the incentives in the existing welfare system. But it's also much more than that. We have to look at those things that are government policies that make it difficult to get jobs, that make it difficult to finish school, that make it difficult to get married. Those are all problems as well.
So I'm reading the summary of this on Amazon. And by the way, Joe, will you go ahead and put the Amazon page up on the screen for the people watching so they can see what the book looks like? It says here, the author, argues that conservative critiques of a culture of poverty fail to account for the structural circumstances in which the poor live, especially racism, gender discrimination, and economic dislocation. However, he also criticizes liberal calls for fighting poverty through redistribution or new government programs. So tell us a little bit about that. How do you balance those two? Because, I'm somebody who's we on the right, and we hear about racism and gender discrimination a lot from people on the left, and sometimes we just roll our eyes because a lot of times people claim racism when there is no racism. I'm assuming, Michael, you're talking about actual racism.
Yeah, I'm talking about the real thing.
Okay.
Look, it's a simple economic truth that people make decisions within the constraints of their circumstances. Now, we can't take away people's free choice. You can't pretend that people's decisions don't matter and there's no consequences to their actions. So, of course, we should expect the poor to behave in ways that help get them out of poverty, finish school, get a job, get married, and so forth. But you also have to look at the circumstances in which they live. And if you live in an area with few jobs, if you live in an area with lousy government schools, if you live in an area where the police are constantly hassling you, if you live in areas in which government policies drive up the cost of housing and rent, or government regulations make it hard to start a business or get a job, then you're going to make different decisions than if you live in an upper middle class largely white suburb. So you've got to look at those circumstances as well.
Yeah, I definitely, the environment and things like that definitely are going to have effects. And so how do you, let's talk about this. I mean, what are some solutions or what are some ideas, in your opinion, to try to, like you say, how to bring wealth to America's poor? I mean, that is the goal. And so what are some of the solutions?
Well, for example, we need to reform our education system. We need to do something about the monopoly we have of government schools, which largely exist to serve the teachers' unions rather than exist to serve parents and children. The fact is that without an education in society today, you really can't become part of the economy. There was a time, a while back in nostalgia days, in which you could drop out of school, go down to the factory, and get a job that supported your family. That's gone, and it's never coming back. You need to have the skills to take part in a modern economy today. That means a much better school system, and that means we really need to give more control and choice to parents over their children's education. The parents and the children are actually the customers, not the teachers' union, not the bureaucracies, not the administrators.
Yeah, and there is a mentality with public education. I've called it the education industrial complex, especially when you look at how I think there's people who figured out that there is no limit to how much money you can get politicians to approve for education, right? I mean, it's money's going to solve the problem, right? So I think there's a lot of money being made on this idea of public education, and yet, if you look at, I think public education used to do some things right. I mean, you had, we put men on the moon. I know Stephen Curry doesn't think so. I saw that the Golden State Warriors, he doesn't think that we did it. But you know what I'm saying? Like, we're pretty smart. We had the education thing figured out, but it seems like it's just gotten worse. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, monopolies never do a very good job. You look at businesses, and if there's no competition, that means there's very little innovation. People keep doing things the same old way, whether they work or not. What we need to do is create more in competition and innovation in education. We need to have people coming up with new ideas, and that will push us a long way towards change. Mm-hmm. But it's not just education. We also need to do things like look at criminal justice reform. The fact is that if you get arrested when you're a kid and you carry that felony conviction on your record your whole life, it makes it very difficult when you're an adult to get a job. And if you can't get a job, you can't support a family. William J. Wilson from Harvard talks about the fact that there's 1.5 million young black men in the criminal justice system that effectively takes them out of the marriage pool. And that contributes a lot to the fact that we have this massive increase in births outside of marriage with all the problems that entails.
Yesterday, the president mentioned criminal justice reform. I've got a USA Today article. Mitch McConnell, in reversal, says Senate will vote on criminal justice reform. I know there's some Republicans that have a problem with it, but there's some Republicans who think it's a good thing, and there's Democrats. This may be an example of bipartisanship where, you're going to have some real reform here that you think. Let me ask you this. The current discussions, the ideas on the current criminal justice reform, would this accomplish some of what you think needs to get done?
Yeah, this bill before the Congress right now that is finally looks like it's going to get a vote in the Senate is a step in the right direction. Now, most criminal justice reform is actually at the state level. The federal system is actually somewhat limited, but it's certainly a step in the right direction in terms of dealing with some of the disparities between different types of drug laws and dealing with educational and vocational opportunities for people to learn skills while they're in prison, and in dealing with some of the really absurdities of three-strike laws and mandatory minimum sentences that often punish very low-level drug dealers as if they were kingpins.
We're talking with Michael Tanner. He is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. His new book, The Inclusive Economy, How to Bring Wealth to America's Poor. Housing deregulation. That's one of your ideas. What can be done? Well, let me ask you this. The status quo, why is it bad?
Well, the rents are just too darn high. I mean, to quote somebody. The fact is that for poor people, rent or housing costs eats up a disproportionate amount of their income. And ironically, it is government policies that often push those rents up, particularly land use and zoning laws make it very expensive to live. In some places like San Francisco and New York, it can drive up the cost of housing by 50%. Now, that not only eats up a lot of income for poor people, but it locks them into poor communities. They can't move to where there's a better school or more jobs or less crime. They basically are locked out of better communities, and that's a problem.
And so banking reform is also one of your concepts here. So now, and I've never even heard of that one. That's very unique.
Well, we know that the way to get out of poverty is not through consumption. It's through wealth. You actually want people to save their money, not spend it. And yet it's a combination of banking laws and welfare policies that discourages people from saving. It's actually relatively difficult for poor people to open a bank account. We have all this talk about what we should do about IDs for voting and all that. What people don't realize is you also have to have ID in order to open a bank account. And about 20% of poor people lack the proper ID to do so. If you don't have a bank account, you're then forced into other types of banking, from payday lending to pawn shops or other ways in which to save and borrow, and they can often cause many problems.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a real good point. And, to me, it kind of comes back also to the first point about education, and that's going to happen with more educational choice. And we tried here in Arkansas, we tried to get a very, very basic school choice bill passed a couple of years ago, and we couldn't get it done because, we had a lot of superintendents actually misrepresenting what the bill was going to do across the state. And while we don't have teacher unions here, it kind of feels like we do,
Well, the administrators are often even more bureaucratic than the teachers in many cases, and they feel that the school system exists largely for them. It doesn't. It exists for parents.
Wow, that is very well said. Well, hey, listen, I know we're out of time here, Michael D. Tanner. Really appreciate it. It's great to meet you. Your book, The Inclusive Economy, folks, check it out. If you're looking for a gift to give to a family member or a friend, this is something you need to look into, how to bring wealth to America's poor. It certainly is a subject that we need to, reanalyze, because whatever we've been doing hasn't worked, since the Great Society. Michael Tanner, I appreciate it, sir.
Anytime.
All righty. Thank you. He's with the Cato Institute, folks.